Hello, coaches! Welcome back to another episode of Coach Better Spotlight. Today, I'm chatting with Elisa Perras, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Coach at the Columbus School in Columbia. Over the past year, Elisa has worked with all stakeholder groups to build a vision and framework for social justice across the school. This Spotlight episode focuses on reflective prompts coaches and teachers can use to consider how we bring a lens of justice and equity into every subject area. In the full-length audio podcast, we discuss how Elisa and her school community are building the systems needed to create agents of change. To hear the full episode, subscribe to Coach Better wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy today's episode, you will love all of the resources and professional learning experiences we're curating for you here at Eduro Learning. Check out our website to see all of our latest offerings at edurolearning.com. Welcome back to another episode of Coach Better. Today, I am super excited to be here with Elisa Perras, and she has a super unique coaching job, in my opinion, and so I kind of want to get her to start talking about that right away. But we are going to have a really interesting conversation about coaching and social justice and equity in international schools around the world. Welcome, Elisa.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're at, what your current job is, and how you got there? Because as I just mentioned, I think it's super interesting. And from what I know, one of the very few positions like that.
Yeah, so I am located in Medellin, Colombia. I have been in international teaching for 7 years and in Colombia for 6 of those 7 years. I currently work as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice coach. So that is my official title. And so part of my work actually, so I manage our senior graduation program, which is called Innovation for Social Change, and then work under the title Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Coach. And I mentioned the senior program because it's kind of how my job came to be. I was actually contracted as a English literature teacher. I've been certified high school language arts. I've got education. Actually never saw myself in education. Not one of the ways that I could really make an impact in terms of fighting for equality and addressing injustice was as an educator. And began as a literature teacher kind of from the mentality that art imitates life, and a lot of the conversations that I wanted to have with my students could be had through literature. And then I was hired at my school in Medellin, and a couple of different things were happening simultaneously. We were simultaneously talking about our school's mission and vision and going through sort of like just a revision process and asking ourselves, how authentically are we living to this mission and vision, and how much does this mission and vision really represent who we want to be as a school? And at the same time, I was being really vocal about our students and what it was that we were having walk across the graduation stage and what it meant to have students who were incredibly intellectual, based on these traditional standards, which I can talk about later, but maybe lacked empathy or didn't know how to put empathy in practice. And so that led to a conversation that allowed me to design the course Innovation for Social Change, which is our senior graduation project, which I did for 2 years. I just kind of built the boat as I was sailing it, designed that course, and created this whole senior graduation project, which led to another conversation, which was seniors at 17 and 18 are well formed in their ideologies. And it's not to say that it's too late, because it's never too late to learn and unlearn. It's never too late to want to decide to examine where the systems of injustice live in our world. But the sooner you start, the better. And so I advocated for that. I had experience in the States working as a equity coach. And so that was something that was already on my resume in the US. And so I advocated for what might it look like for us? We use the term agents of change in our new school purpose. And what might it look for us to actually put that into our systems? right? When we think about literacy, we have systems. We have Lucy Calkins, we have Readers Writers Workshop. When we think about numeracy, we choose systems and integrate those systems into our schools. For us, it's Bridges Math. And so my question to my school is, what might it look like to actually build the system that says we actually create agents of positive change? And what might it look like to have support for our teachers in doing that work? And so that's where my role came from. And that's been kind of my journey with the school is trying to build those systems and provide support to our teachers in terms of looking at all of the facets of education: classroom culture, curriculum, professional development, professional learning, and where we can be more inclusive and more just in our practices.
You mentioned that in your English literature, you feel like you have a solid foundation and a bit of flexibility to play with in terms of being able to have these really deep conversations with kids in content that really supports those conversations. How do you help those other subject areas that are maybe a little bit more tangential? Like you mentioned science and math. I had a really great, I can't remember who it was with, but I had a really great conversation about looking at all different subjects through this lens of diversity, equity, justice, inclusion. And I would love to hear you talk about how do you do that in subjects that don't feel like a natural fit?
Yeah. And so I think part of the first answer is just I needed to do my work, and I'm still researching. Like, I am not from a science or math background. And so like the first part of my job, and that's what makes this job a bit difficult too, is because I'm K through 12. And so I'm constantly researching and I'm constantly learning, because as an educator, I wasn't K through 12. As an educator, I was a high school English teacher, and that was my expertise. And so a huge part of the work has been educating myself and admitting where I have blind spots and doing the learning. But it's also been like looking at setting some norms with teachers around skill development and talking about skill development and like what we want from students. And I know that you have these standards and these objectives, and then having that coaching conversation of like, what do you want them to be able to do? What are some of the skills, like with a science class, inquiry and questioning and so having that conversation of, okay, so how can we develop that skill where they're learning some of this content, but they're also looking at it through the lens of how this plays out in the world? Because everything, I was in a webinar earlier today, and one of the speakers was talking about, in just like the first thing that we have to understand is, as practitioners of justice, as co-conspirators, as aspiring allies, is that this work is everywhere and all around us. It's in the air we breathe. And so having that conversation, like science has been used to oppress. Math has been used to oppress. Math has been used, when you look at, there's so many examples of how these contents have been used historically to create racial hierarchies, to establish systems of oppression. And so it's flipping that on its head and asking, how can we also use this content for the work of liberation, for the work of the humanity, for the work of justice? And a lot of times I'm learning alongside of that teacher, and I'm asking that question. Like, I worked with the science team this year, and we didn't do a pilot unit. It was more just me trying to understand, like, with your team, we don't have to pilot anything this year, but I would really love to just sit in your guys' sessions, have these conversations, and learn alongside of you as I start to try to make sense of how can we use science as a space for liberation, because it absolutely has historically been used as a space for oppression. So let's figure that out together. So I don't have a clear answer, because I think I'm still figuring it out. And I do know that one part of the work that I hold myself to is to always remember that this has been done. Like, this is not new. People have been fighting for their liberation, for their livelihood, for their humanity in all spaces. And particularly in schools, as an educator, I need to remember that there are those who have come before me. And when I don't know how to do something, I need to be okay with saying, I don't know how to do something, but I'm going to look to those who have gone before me. I'm going to look to the scholars of justice before me, because it's mind-blowing how much stuff is out there if you take the time to really look for it instead of getting stuck. And I have to model that for teachers too. I have to model saying, okay, we don't know the answer, but we're going to figure it out because it's out there. And we just have to be creative with it, and we can explore this together. So yeah, I think those are more just like my approach of how to get into it. I can't tell you right now, specifically a unit I've piloted with science or a unit I've done with math, but I do believe that, fundamentally, I know that math and sciences and even the rewriting of history and the whitewashing of history. These systems have been used to oppress folks since the beginning of time. So if they've been used to oppress, they absolutely have to be able to be used to liberate. And so being on that journey and figuring that out with my teachers has been fun.
I think that's so cool. And I think the examples that you're talking about modeling being a learner and modeling looking at those who went before you and modeling, not knowing, I think that's a really important part of all this, right? Because I think a lot of times in coaching positions, teachers will see us as consultants, as experts, as people who know all the answers. And that's really not realistic in almost any coaching position, whatever the subject is that you're coaching. So when you are demonstrating that bit of vulnerability, which you've mentioned a couple of times, and when you're demonstrating that bit about being a learner, and you're demonstrating that we might be doing this for the first time, but we can learn it together successfully from others who have done this, I think that's all part of creating this like beautiful culture of coaching that allows teachers to be open to trying new things in many different areas, right? So I think that's super, super important and can translate across any coaching area. I also really
sorry. No, I was just going to say I'm incredibly grateful for my coaching team has modeled that for me, who has shown me you are going to need to wear different hats at different times. Sometimes you're a resource provider. Sometimes you're a coach. Sometimes you're a consultant. Sometimes you're a co-learner. And you need to, and so I'm grateful for their modeling. I work with some amazing and incredible coaches who have helped me practice that and be okay with saying I don't always have all the answers, and that's not my role as a coach. My role as a coach is a bunch of different things, and sometimes yes, it is consulting and resource providing, but sometimes it's just sitting alongside of you and learning together and creating that safe space to learn together. So I'm grateful for them who've taught me that model.
And I think any school that invests in coaching, they have to see that the coaching as a team and coaching from different subject areas and that perspective of we're all learners, teachers and students. I think that's the key aspect of building a coaching culture. I think a lot of schools have coaches for the name, but not necessarily for the real deep work of being learners and creating learners. And you're just totally demonstrating that in so many different ways. I was going to say one other thing. Did you want to say something?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
I also think it's really, I love that you are saying these subjects have been used to oppress. How can we use them for liberation? And I think that just that statement, it provides enough of a check to your thinking to think about all of those different ways that these subjects have been used to oppress and how can we flip that switch? I mean, I'm always trying to make a comparison to what I am normally doing, which is kind of more in the tech or just instructional coaching field. And I'm like, what is that question that I can ask? But I think that is such a good, starting point question to get any subject teacher to think about, what does my subject look like through time? And how is my subject in the real world used to impact human beings? Because sometimes we get so caught up in the content of what we're teaching, we don't think about the impact. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those kinds of conversations. Maybe you've had them, maybe you're thinking about having them, maybe they're things that you've thought yourselves. What are the kinds of things that teachers in any variety of subject area can think about to kind of put that diversity, equity, inclusion, justice lens on their subject area? What are those what are those prompts or questions that people can start thinking through?
Yeah. So I consider myself like an abolitionist teacher in progress. I say in progress because it's constantly learning. And I'm, about a year ago, I read a book called We Want to Do More Than Just Survive, which is a book on abolitionist teaching by a woman named Dr. Bettina Love. And that sort of began my journey. And I share that to say, the tenets of abolitionist teaching is recognizing that these systems were never set up for the success of brown and black kids. These systems were never set up, and I'll also refer to James Baldwin, who's a thinker and activist from the 60s, and he talked about the very paradox of education is that it is set up within a social framework. And so it is designed to maintain that social framework. So when I think about the kind of questions that I ask people, or the kind of questions that I want to ask people as I develop my coaching practice is I kind of root it in reminding myself as an abolitionist educator that this is not the system that I ultimately want to be working in. I am seeking to tear this whole system down and rebuild it from the ground. But I also know that abolition is a process. Even right now in the conversation that's happening in light of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and all these conversations around the consistent brutalization and Black death that, Americans have become almost numb to until there is a viral, moment. And right now, part of that viral moment is the conversation of abolish the police. And I know a lot of people's immediate reaction and fear to that is like, so we're just going to get rid of police and there's no more police. And my practice as an educator, when I think about my practice as an abolitionist teacher, is reminding myself that abolition is a process. It's keeping the end goal in mind. And the end goal in mind is knowing that these systems were set up under white supremacy. And so if these systems were set up under white supremacy, under patriarchal, under heteronormativity, they were not set up to serve everyone. And so the ultimate goal is to tear them down and build something new. But in that process, some of the questions that I think about that I want to include in my practice are moving away from the traditional questions that these systems ask, like, what are your standards? Or what does achievement look like for you? Or what is rigor? I think that those questions have been asked enough within these systems. And for me, I think about like, how do we introduce love back into our classroom? How do we, where did your students experience joy in this lesson plan? One of my mentors, Dr. Javon Hunter, he talks about that a lot as he coaches his teachers, of asking them, okay, thanks for that lesson plan that we're looking at together. Can you identify for me where your students felt love, where they felt joy, where they saw themselves as human? And I think, for me, it's asking those similar questions to teachers of like, how can this work, this unit, help kids reconsider what it means to be human? How can this learning introduce joy? How can this learning introduce, and I think it's also reshaping, like, that it doesn't have to happen in every single moment. I think that's a fear that a lot of teachers have, is that the whole lesson plan has to be around justice. No, it can be over the course of a unit. It can be in your warm-up. It can be having a reflection piece at the end. But I think, it's not to say, that we don't want to ask the questions about rigor, about standards, but I also know that that's part of a system that wasn't necessarily set up for equity and justice in the first place. That's part of a system that was set up to benefit certain people. And so in my practice, I do want to try to flip that as much as I can and ask questions about, and radically dream about an entirely different system. And that's what it means for me too, to be an abolitionist educator in progress as I continue to learn. What does a radically different system look like for our kids, where they're in the classroom and they experience joy and hope and humanity, and asking teachers where they can see that in their lessons? And when the answer is like, well, it's not there, then my question is, how can we put it there? How can we inject it there? I'm not saying take away your standards. I'm not saying take away rigor, but if you can't tell me, where do we see hope? Where do we see humanity? Where do we see joy? And your answer is, I don't really know. Then let's explore. Is there a place to inject it into this work? Because I think, to me, that's part of radically imagining an entirely different system of education that serves everybody and isn't set up to just serve a societal framework of white supremacy or of heteronormativity or of patriarchy. And so that was a long-winded answer, but I hope it answered your question.
That was great. I really appreciate the open-endedness of the questions, and I like how you're giving me everything in comparative. Like, instead of asking this question, can you ask this question? It doesn't necessarily mean the first question is bad. It just means, can we bring some conversation over here to this other question? And I think that idea of, obviously, I can't imagine any educator that doesn't hear, where do you see hope and joy in this lesson? And not I'm tearing up listening to you talk about it, right? I can't imagine any educator that isn't like, oh my gosh, I need to make sure that's happening, because that's why I'm here. I'm here because of the passion, because of the joy, because of the excitement, and that's what we want to instill in the people, adults, children, parents that we work with on a regular basis. So I hope that question makes teachers be excited and not fearful. Because I know a lot of times when we're coaching, it's bringing in change, and change brings in fear. But so I think that those straightforward questions that get at the heart of what we're doing are questions that can help prompt teachers to remind themselves why they're here. And I think that's really important. Thanks for watching today's episode. Don't forget to check out edurolearning.com for more great learning opportunities and connect with us on social media at Eduro Learning to stay up to date with everything we share.